youngest child, Lacey, was born, things didn't go according to plan. She arrived about a month earlier than expected, back in December of 2014. Instead of a calm delivery and bringing her home right away, we found ourselves in the NICU. It wasn't what we had imagined or prepared for. Got a couple of pictures of her in the hospital. We'll get those pictures eventually. But that experience reminds me that some of the most significant moments in our lives don't unfold the way that we expect them to. So there she is in her, I don't know what you call it, incubator, right? Incubator with all the tubes and all of that. Under the blue light, I guess it is. And then the next picture is the day we took her home, and you can see how tiny she is. We had to put little towels on either side just to make it so that she wouldn't move around too much in her car seat. So that didn't go according to plan. That's not what we expected. Now we can think about the birth of Jesus. It didn't go as Mary and Joseph had expected either. There was no room for them in Bethlehem. Jesus was born where animals were kept, and he was laid in a manger. And so already God's plan was unfolding in uncomfortable and unexpected ways. But as hard as that beginning was, it was only the start. Soon after, as we read just a moment ago, King Herod heard from the wise men that they were looking for the one who had been born king of the Jews. And so Herod, threatened and desperate to protect his power, he sought to kill Jesus. And so in the middle of the night, Mary and Joseph were forced to flee Bethlehem and travel all the way to Egypt. And this part of the story reminds us that following God's plan often involves disruption. It involves fear, uncertainty, and movement we didn't anticipate. But God is faithful. His path for us is not always easy. And it rarely looks the way that we expected it to. But again, God is faithful. And he was faithful with Mary and Joseph. And this other journey we see in the story of Christmas. So before we get into these verses, we were introduced to Herod back in the first verse of Matthew chapter 2. So let's turn our attention to Herod for a moment, the man who is known in history as Herod the Great. Though we wouldn't really describe him today as being all that great. He sometimes, when we prepare sermons and we involve Herod, we sometimes compare him to notorious Christmas characters like Scrooge and the Grinch. But even at their worst, those figures don't come close to Herod and his evil. Now, a little bit of a background on Herod. Herod was an Edomite by ancestry, though he was raised as a Jew. And in 40 BC, the Roman Senate, these were the days of the Roman Empire, the Roman Senate appointed Herod king of the Jews. So the title didn't come from the people of Israel, didn't come from God, of course. It came from Rome. And in order to legitimize his rule, because he really wasn't accepted by the Jewish people, to legitimize his rule, Herod launched massive building projects. And the most notable project was his expansion of the Second Temple. The Second Temple, we read of it in the Old Testament. It was the temple built after the Babylonians had destroyed the first temple. And in comparison, the Second Temple really didn't compare to the first temple. And so Herod, to gain favor with the people, he expanded the temple and made it a lot nicer. Herod really functioned as a client king ruling on Rome's behalf. His job was pretty simple: keep order, suppress rebellion, and ensure that taxes flowed steadily to the empire. Now, history remembers Herod for his paranoia and brutality. He executed several members of his own family, wives, sons, and relatives, because he suspected that they might be a threat to his throne. Emperor Augustus once said, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." So that's the kind of man that Herod was. Not a great father or husband, to say the least, or king. So it's no surprise that when Herod heard that the wise men were searching for a child born king of the Jews, he didn't respond with curiosity or worship. He responded with fear. So to Herod, this child wasn't a promise, he was a threat. And Herod was willing to eliminate this threat by any means necessary. So that's a little bit of a background to Herod, King Herod. And that'll help us understand why he did what he did. So in this passage, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus take two journeys. And this is part of the series Christmas on the Move, looking at these journeys. And we didn't actually see them all. There are other journeys we could have looked at, but we looked at a few of them. And so two are mentioned here in Matthew chapter 2, 13 through 23. First, their flight to Egypt, and then their return to Nazareth. So Christmas, once again, is on the move. So as we watch these movements unfold, they teach us something essential about what it means to follow God's plan for our lives. So I want to draw out two applications from this part of the story. And here's the first. And really, I've already begun to talk about this in my introduction. So the first thing is, doing God's will sometimes leads us into difficult and unexpected paths. But it's always better to obey than to stay put. So let's look again at those verses in Matthew chapter 2, going back to verses 13 through 15. Now, when they had departed, that's referring to the wise men, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Now, there are three prophecies mentioned in this passage, and I had intended originally to look at all three, but I realized that would take a lot of time, and really the prophecies are quite complex when you look at the original context. So we'll look at the third one briefly, but the first two we really won't have time to look at. But this is a prophecy from the book of Hosea. If you're really interested, I did do a sermon on this a couple of years ago in my series, Christmas According to the Minor Prophets. So you can find that actually on our YouTube channel. 2 years ago, you could search it up if you're really interested. And it is quite an interesting prophecy. And all of these prophecies really aren't a simple, the prophet predicted this about the Messiah and it was fulfilled by Jesus. Here it's more of like a pattern that we see in the Old Testament regarding Israel and the Exodus. You could even see Moses in this, where Pharaoh in the book of Exodus is killing the baby boys, but Moses is saved. And here Jesus, Herod is wanting to kill the baby boys, and Jesus escapes. That briefly is sort of what Matthew is saying here when going back to Hosea. And there's the thought of Egypt, of course, going to Egypt and coming out of Egypt. But we'll look at the third prophecy. The first two, again, we don't really have time, and they're complex and a lot involved in looking at exactly what Matthew was thinking when he quoted these Old Testament prophets. But looking at these verses 13 through 15, think about what this meant for Mary and Joseph to get up in the middle of the night and to take this journey to Egypt. This was not a short trip. If Joseph and Mary traveled to the part of Egypt where many Jewish communities were located, they would have covered somewhere between 240 and 320 kilometers. So in our part of the world, that would mean us traveling by foot from here to maybe Moncton, or if it was on the further end of that range, it could be going all the way to Charlottetown. So that's quite a journey on foot. Now, in the ancient world, a good day's journey on foot might be 25 to 30 kilometers. That's under ideal conditions. But of course, these were not ideal conditions. They were traveling with a young child. Those of us who've had that experience know that it's often not easy. Likely they were moving cautiously and perhaps even secretly. So what might normally take a couple of weeks could easily have stretched into maybe 4 to 6 weeks on the road. So not a short, not an easy journey, a very difficult one. An unexpected journey. All of a sudden being told in a dream to get up in the middle of the night and go to Egypt on foot. Now, God never promises that obedience will give us an easy journey through life. In fact, the Bible says the opposite. Matthew 16:24, these are the words of Jesus. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Deny himself. That doesn't sound very, very easy. Take up your cross. That speaks of suffering. Following Jesus. Acts 14:22 says, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And then Jesus says in John 16:33, in the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So the Bible never tries to trick us and say, well, just come to Jesus, start following him, and the troubles you experienced in the past, they will be no more, and life will be comfortable and easy for the rest of your days. Jesus never said that. The Bible never says that. He actually says really the opposite, that following him can get us into more difficulty. Depending on, everyone's life is different, but it could result in more suffering, more tribulation, more difficulty. And so following God, his will for our lives, his plan, that's something that's not always easy. It wasn't easy for Mary and Joseph. And Jesus never said it would be easy for us. So following him often means movement, leaving what is familiar, comfortable, and predictable. But it's always better to move forward with God than to remain where we are without him. It's always better to move with God than to stay where we are and be without him. So for Mary and Joseph, as we've seen, obedience meant packing up in the dark and stepping into a long, exhausting journey. For us, it might mean walking through hardship we never would have chose on our own. Yet again, God is faithful. He doesn't waste our obedience, and he doesn't abandon us on the road. Even in trouble, he is at work, saw that in the story of Joseph recently. And he will honor faithfulness as we follow him step by step. He will honor our faithfulness. Doesn't promise an easy life, but he will honor our faithfulness. He will reward us for our faithfulness. So again, doing God's will, number one, sometimes leads us into difficult and unexpected paths. But it's always better to obey God than to stay where we are. Let's continue on, verses 16 through 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. So here's the second prophecy. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Now, this event is often referred to as the massacre of the innocents. And I looked up this event on Wikipedia, and their article says that a majority of Herod biographers consider the story fabricated or unhistorical. In other words, they don't believe that it happened. So their argument goes something like this. If something like this really happened, these baby boys being killed in Bethlehem, if something like that really happened, wouldn't we expect to find a record of it somewhere besides Matthew's gospel? It's a good question. And it is an important issue because it goes to the credibility of the Gospels, Matthew's Gospel in particular, and the Bible really. Can we believe what it says, or are these things made up? So the trustworthiness of the Bible is at stake here. Now, there are at least two reasons why the absence of other records about this incident doesn't mean that the event didn't take place. So first of all, the scale of the tragedy is often misunderstood. So when we hear this, when we read this, we tend to imagine hundreds of children being killed. But Bethlehem truly was a little town. So most scholars estimate that Bethlehem's population at the time of Jesus' birth was somewhere between 300 and 1,000 people, with many placing it at the lower end of that range. So that would mean that the number of boys 2 years old and under was likely fewer than 20. So the idea that hundreds or thousands of baby boys were killed here just doesn't line up with what we know about Bethlehem. So it was probably a dozen, no more than 20 boys who were killed. Still, obviously, a tragedy, but probably not one that would make front page news. These kinds of things were more common back then than they are perhaps today. And then the second reason is that brutality, as we've already seen, brutality wasn't unusual for Herod. He was known for doing these sorts of things. People who were more notable or famous were killed by Herod. And so it wouldn't have been something so notable that unknown babies were killed. So one incident about Herod was that when Herod was dying, he was concerned that nobody would mourn his death, which is kind of understandable, that no one would mourn his death. So he ordered that certain respected men be killed the moment he died. So it didn't seem to matter to him that they wouldn't be mourning for him. He just wanted some people to be mourning when he died. So against that backdrop, what we know about Herod, The killing of a small number of children in a village would not have stood out as noteworthy to first century historians. So those are a couple of reasons why no one, perhaps, that we have in existence today, a record of this happening. Let's continue on. But I wanted to mention that because if you study this, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, this could never have happened. Well, it could have happened, and it lines up with what we know about Herod. Verses 19 through 23, last part of this passage. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. So we're told that Herod died. Historians place Herod's death in 4 BC, which means that Jesus must have been born in or before 4 BC. Sounds kind of strange to our ears, since BC means before Christ. But Herod ordered baby boys 2 years old or younger to be killed. So that tells us that Jesus was probably born between 6 BC and 4 BC. That our calendar, obviously, that shows us that it's not perfectly precise. It was developed centuries later. So they didn't get the exact timing of the birth of Jesus correct. They were a little late, I think, on the BC AD separation of time on the calendar that we use today. But probably between 6 BC and 4 BC was when Jesus was born. And Matthew says that Joseph, after they were in Egypt, he settled his family in Nazareth. And then he adds a third fulfillment statement, verse 23, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, when you study that, when you look for where that was said in the Old Testament, it's kind of puzzling because Nazareth is never mentioned in the Old Testament. In fact, it didn't even exist in Old Testament times. So what does Matthew mean here when he says the prophet said that he would be called a Nazarene? Well, notice that this prophecy comes not from a single prophet, but from the prophets, plural. So Matthew isn't pointing to one specific prediction. I believe he's summarizing a repeated theme in the prophets, that the Messiah would be unimpressive, unexpected, and ultimately rejected. We see this, for example, in the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 53, probably, when you think of a prophecy of the Messiah being rejected, this is the one that first comes to mind. Isaiah 53, verses 2 and 3. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. So he wasn't impressive looking. He didn't come from an impressive place. Nazareth fits that picture perfectly. It was a small, obscure, and looked down upon town. And that's why when Philip told Nathanael in John 1, chapter 1, that he believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, Nathanael responded, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And so there isn't a place in the Old Testament where it specifically says he would be a Nazarene. But what Matthew is saying here is that throughout the Old Testament prophets, there was the foretelling that the Messiah wouldn't live up to people's expectations in some ways. And included in that was that he came from this little place, Nazareth. So the second movement, the return to Nazareth, teaches us something important. So this is the second of two applications. Following Jesus means identifying with a man who was despised and rejected. And if we follow him closely, we shouldn't be surprised when we're treated the same way. And so as Christians, if we call ourselves a Christian, we're identifying ourselves with Christ. We're saying, I am his follower. I believe that he died on a cross for my sins. I'm going to follow his teachings. There's a ritual that we go through which really identifies us as a follower of Christ. What is that ritual? It's baptism. I just want us to think about baptism for a moment. Baptism is a visible step of allegiance to Christ. It's a way of saying, I belong to him. Even if that means being misunderstood or looked down on. I know that here at Forest Hills, I've had about no less than 4 people recently talk to me about baptism. It's a step of faith, and I hope that soon into the new year, we'll have a baptism service, and those who've been talking about baptism, or maybe some others, will take that step of faith and be baptized, identifying with Christ visibly. As Baptists, we believe in what we call believers' baptism. That's why we don't baptize babies here in our church. We wait for a profession of faith, believable profession of faith, and it's after faith that we baptize people, believers' baptism. And so we're saying, I have believed in Jesus. My desire is to follow him, and so we're baptized. We show that by being baptized. And I believe that's the pattern we see in Scripture, especially in the book of Acts. So believers' baptism. If you've been thinking about baptism, I challenge you to follow through with that if you've spoken to me about it, or if you haven't, but you've been thinking about it, the Lord is nudging you in that direction, then come speak to me about that. I know that others are thinking about a little bit of a related topic, church membership. I've had at least 6 people talk to me about church membership in the last couple months, and giving you the application, waiting on that. Don't want to rush you or pressure you, but follow through. We're coming into a new year. And it'll take a little while to talk to everyone about that, but I hope maybe February, if no later than March, we have a baptism service and we welcome some people into our church as members. And so identifying with the church, belonging to a church officially, identifying ourselves with Christ as baptized believers. As we've seen this morning, Christmas on the move doesn't just lead us into safer places. It seems safer just to stay where we are, not to go forward, not to take any further steps of faith, not to be baptized, not to commit ourselves to a church, not to be involved in a ministry or any of that. It seems safer to stay where we are. But really, the Christian life is about daily taking those steps of faith, taking up our cross and following Christ. And so it means that sometimes there will be unexpected things, difficult things. Maybe there will be people who don't like that, as we've seen with Jesus being called a Nazarene. There were people who didn't like him, who rejected him, who looked down upon him, and that people might do the same to us today. But Christmas on the Move just doesn't lead us to safer places. It leads us into faithful identification with Christ. Baptism is a big part of that, and following through on that commitment is an even bigger part of that. A daily thing, not just a one-time thing. And so Christmas on the Move. We've looked at some of the journeys of Christmas, not all of them, but this morning the flight to Egypt in the middle of the night, the return to Nazareth. He was a Nazarene. Those things were not easy. They led to difficulty. The same might happen to us today, but it's always better to obey and to move forward than it would be to stay put. To move forward, to journey in faith, as these ones did in the first Christmas story. So I challenge you, if the Holy Spirit is nudging you in a direction, don't just keep putting that off. Don't ignore it. Don't stay where you are. Move forward in faith. And the Lord will bless you for it.